Going live in 5 seconds.
Okay. Hello, everyone, and welcome to Under One Roof's webinar on heating flats, overcoming the challenges of zero emissions heating in Scottish tenements. My name is Mike Heffron. I'm the Chief Executive of Under One Roof Scotland. And we're joined here today by Gillian Campbell and Fabrice Leveque, who's going to be talking through some of the challenges and opportunities that we have around heating tenement flats when it comes to net zero carbon emissions. So just a bit of an introduction before we get started. I'll talk through who we are, introduce our speakers a little bit more, and then explain the format of what we're going to be talking about over the next hour or so. First of all, Under One Roof and who we are. Under One Roof is Scotland's only charity dedicated to supporting tenement owners, and that includes tenement flat owners, and that includes owner-occupiers and landlords, as well as housing professionals and factors, surveyors, local authorities that work in the private housing sector, and any number of other sort of intersecting groups that are interested in organizing common repairs in tenement flats. Included in that, and something we've expanded upon, is work around retrofit, which has become much more to the fore in the past couple of years or so, and it's going to be increasingly important as far as what tenement flat owners are going to need to do. And so we wanted to organize this event to talk about some of the particular challenges around zero emission heating in those tenement flats. Under One Roof is, if you're not familiar, has a full a website that has incredible amount of information on how to organize common repairs and manage your tenement flat. We have an inquiry service where you can directly contact us about challenges that you have in your building that's not covered on our website. Our website comes out of a book, actually, so it's, like I said, it's a significant amount of information. We also hold a number of outreach events, and you'll see in the chat room, which I'll talk about in a second, and in the resources or the handout tabs, a link to a number of events that we have coming up over the next couple of months. We've already been out to about 10 local authorities in the past couple of months. We're going to be hitting another 10 or so in the upcoming months. So we're very likely going to be near you sometime soon, or conducting a webinar directly with a local authority in your area. Under One Roof is sponsored by funding from Scottish Government, from local authorities, and the Safe Deposit Scotland Charitable Trust. And we provide independent information on all of those issues. And people get in touch. Oftentimes, local authorities will direct people directly onto us, actually. One, because we have the amount of expertise we have, and two, because we're an independent voice, and so you can feel confident that you're getting independent information. One final thing on Under One Roof before we get going is a bit of a disclaimer, is that although we're providing information to you, if there is anything that requires particular technical challenges, it's important to seek the advice of a professional, whether that be a solicitor or a professional such as a surveyor, and so on. So we provide information, not directly advice. We won't tell you what to do. We'll tell you what options there are. And that's just a little bit just as far as sort of having a legal disclaimer on what we do. So let me introduce our speakers today. We've got Fabrice. He is the Climate and Energy Policy Manager at WWF Scotland. Hello, Fabrice.
Hiya.
And Gillian. Gillian is the Communications and Public Affairs Lead at the Existing Homes Alliance. So what we're going to do is, for over the next hour or so, is start with Fabrice. Now, Fabrice has put together a video presentation, and that's going to play after I'm done here. It's going to run about 15 minutes, and he's going to talk a little bit about the research by WWF on heat pumps, identifying potential solutions for flats, which include not just heat pumps, but district heating and other emerging solutions, and also some recommendations that they have put forward in the research that they've done. And then we'll take some questions from you on heat pumps, district heating, and anything related to the issues that Fabrice has brought up. Then we'll move on to Gillian. And Gillian, with her work with Existing Home Alliance, has done a significant amount of work and reports on around regulations and what's needed for heating flats. So she's going to talk a little bit about what those regulations are, and also talk about things such as the potential for a boiler, gas boiler phase out, and what we can be doing in the meantime, what regulations are needed, what funding is available for energy efficiency measures currently. And then she's going to be taking some questions and answers on policy and legislative issues that she's raised and what can be done. Now, Big Marker is the webinar for platform that we're using. If you look on your screen, you'll be able to see, I believe it's off to the right on your screen as well. There is a chat. There's a few tabs. One says chat, Q&A, polls, and handouts. So if you have general comments, we would encourage you to put them into the chat section. If you have a question for one of our presenters, pop your questions into the Q&A section. That makes it easier for us just to make sure that we can see all the questions that are coming in. And if there's a couple questions that are the same, we can kind of consolidate them to save some time. That will also, we've got polls that'll be popping up over the course, and we'll get to in a second about why that's important to fill those out. And we have a resources tab, and in there you're going to find a link to our events as well as the slides that Gillian and Fabrice have put together for today, so you can download those and take a look at them as well. Now we have Annie, our communications and engagement officer. She's in the background, but is an incredible resource to making sure this all goes smoothly. She'll send through links as we go and polls to the different things that people are talking about as we go, but also some polls as well, and information about feedback on your experiences. And this is one of the things that we wanted to do with this webinar, is to get your feedback, particularly on what your level of knowledge is and what you've experienced as far as sort of the challenges to net zero carbon heating, and also what you think might work in your situation. That is something that would be really helpful, particularly for the Existing Homes Alliance, to get a sense of what the kind of questions that are coming up from owners and housing professionals, and can help to sort of direct them in a direction to see what kind of questions that we might want to be taking a look at in the future as far as future research. So we'd encourage you to ask questions throughout. You don't need to wait till the end. You can pop them into the Q&A section, and you can also, and we will stay as long as we can to answer all of your questions. If we don't get to your questions, Annie in the background put up a link that you can fill in your questions. We'll get that over to Gillian and Fabrice. You could also email us at info@underoneroof.scot. You can find that on our webpage as well, and drop your question there. So if we will get to everyone's questions one way or another, but hopefully we'll get to them in this session. So without further ado then, why don't we start off with Fabrice's presentation. Like I said, it'll be about 15 minutes or so. We'll come back in, and then Fabrice will have an opportunity to take on any questions that you might have raised over the course of the presentation. So turn it over to that, and we'll see you back here in about 15 minutes.
Good morning. My name is Fabrice. I'm Climate and Energy Policy Manager at WWF Scotland. I'm going to use the next 15 minutes to talk to you about how we decarbonise heating in flats and tenements. And I'll be recapping some research that we published earlier this year on the costs and practicalities of doing that. For those of you who don't know WWF, we're a global conservation organisation active in nearly 100 countries worldwide. Our mission is to help create a world where people and nature can thrive together. Why does WWF work on heating? Well, it's 20% of Scotland's greenhouse gas emissions and half of our annual energy use. So a really important step on the way to tackling climate change. My own background is in energy. In the past, I designed and fitted solar energy systems. And prior to WWF, I was at the Trade Association Scottish Renewables, working on policy for heat networks and renewable electricity generation. So I've got a policy and a practical background to draw on. So I'll start by just confirming the 2 points that I'll be making in this presentation. You can see those on the slide. And those are that electric heat pumps are a key solution for decarbonising homes, and they can be fitted to the vast majority of our homes. However, shared systems like heat networks and communal heating are likely to advantages for flats and tenements. So we should be prioritising those as a first step alongside improvements to energy efficiency. Now, before we get into the technical, a reminder of the wider context for today's conversation. Unfortunately, we are in a climate emergency with an urgent need to cut greenhouse gas emissions to stop global warming. Countries, including the UK, have pledged to reach zero emissions by the middle of the century, and they've also pledged to limit global warming to 1.5 degrees. Now, that's the threshold that scientists tell us is that for a safe and livable climate, and beyond that, we'll see ever more disruptive impacts. So to stay below 1.5 degrees will require a halving of annual greenhouse gas emissions by 2030, by the end of this decade. In Scotland, the Parliament set ambitious targets to cut emissions by 2030 and 2045. And for housing, that means switching nearly half of all homes to low carbon heating by 2030. And that's over 1 million homes. It's a huge challenge given where we are today, with less than 10% of homes on renewable heating. And achieving it will really depend on lots of factors, not least the ability of the industry to scale up, to reduce costs, and the government's ability to support households until those costs reduce. But that's the level of ambition we should be striving for, because that will help us avoid the much bigger costs of climate change in the long run. And it's also an opportunity. It's a chance to switch to homegrown renewables, to get away from the volatile fossil fuel prices that have driven the cost of living crisis, and to create warmer and healthier homes. So turning back to home heating, we commissioned external experts to better understand the costs and practicalities of switching homes to low carbon heat in Scotland. They are called Cambridge Architectural Research, and you can see on the slide the 3 steps that they took in their approach. First of all, they developed 12 typical homes that represent the majority of Scotland's housing stock, and they then scaled that up to match the 2.5 million homes that we have. Step 2 was to run detailed hourly energy modelling to understand the performance of low carbon heating, as well as energy efficiency measures in those typical homes. And then finally, the third step was an economic analysis to find the least cost solution for each of those homes. So this slide shows the typical homes. There are 12 of them in total, 8 houses and 4 flats, which we zoomed in here to give you a bit more detail about them. I should say that the experts also produced subsets of these with different constraints. So where planning restrictions might limit the use of some options, or where smaller homes have limited extra space for equipment. So in total, there are about 35 different modelled homes in the model. Now, I'll briefly explain the different heating solutions that could be applied in the modelling. So the homes began with either gas, oil or electric storage heaters, and then there were a variety of options that could be selected. A range of electric heat pumps. So these use clever physics to extract heat from the air or the ground. They're at least 300% efficient, which means for every unit of electricity consumed, they produce at least 3 units of heat. And they deliver that heat either to a central heating system or via air blowers. Those types of systems are called air-to-air heat pumps. They're less commonly seen in the UK, but you'll have seen them abroad. They're essentially air conditioning units, and the heat is delivered by air blowers that are mounted typically on the wall. The modelling also included other electric options, modern storage radiators. So these are better performing than the older units that we see commonly in the Highlands and can use cheaper overnight electricity and release it during the day. But these are only 100% efficient, so 1 unit of heat for 1 unit of electricity. Also included were infrared panels. Similarly, just 100% efficient, and these work differently to the others in that they don't heat the air directly, but rather they heat the surface of objects using infrared. So that will be furniture or your own skin to create that sensation of warmth and to heat the air in a room. And then finally, in the purple box, you can see the energy efficiency options that were also in the model, and hopefully these are relatively familiar to you. These are all the typical insulation measures that we would recommend in homes. I should say that we didn't include so-called hydrogen boilers. Now these are basically modified gas boilers running on low carbon hydrogen that could be piped to homes via a slightly modified gas network. Now, it wasn't possible to include this in the modelling because it's still a very early stage technology. It's not been commercialised, and all the available evidence suggests that it's likely to be very high cost for households to run. Hydrogen has to be produced from low carbon electricity or from fossil fuels, so it's very resource intensive. And another reason not to use it in homes is that we need to make sure that any supply of low carbon hydrogen is prioritised for other sectors that have fewer options, so things like heavy industry. So turning to the results of the modelling now, this slide shows the heating solution selected across the whole housing stock in a model. Now what do we mean by best heating solution? Well, that's the least cost system, and that was calculated over 15 years, which is the typical age of a boiler, expected age of a boiler. And we calculated this by adding up all the upfront running and maintenance costs over 15 years. As you can see, air source heat pumps dominate. The reason for that is that they're the least cost type of heat pump. They can plug into a wet central heating system, which is what most homes in Scotland have, and they're very versatile. And we also found a role for those air-to-air heat pumps I mentioned earlier, particularly where homes don't have a central heating system, but also where maybe space inside the home is limited. They need slightly less boxes and equipment. So moving on to the results for energy efficiency. And the key finding here is that we found it economic to bring homes up to broadly an Energy Performance Certificate C rating. And what that means is essentially a recommendation to fit the measures you can see there on the slide wherever possible. And that's because we found that with energy prices, and I should say the modelling used energy prices that are pretty similar to what we're seeing today, but at those prices, the upfront cost of installing these measures pays for itself within the 15 years of the study. And it does that in two ways. Obviously, insulation can lower energy demand and lower energy bills, but it also helps to reduce heat pump costs. Now, that's because heat pumps work best at lower flow temperatures. That's the temperature that goes to radiators, and they need a temperature typically of 35 to 50 degrees compared to 60 degrees for an efficient gas boiler. So to make the most effective heat pump system, you'll want to reduce those temperatures through the radiators, and you can do that either making sure that the home's well insulated, or by also fitting larger radiators. And on the flip side of that, fitting a heat pump in a poorly insulated home runs the risk that the heat pump struggles to get to the desired temperatures. So energy efficiency is also a safeguard against that. It's important to note that what we're recommending here isn't an exceptional level of energy efficiency. The most expensive measure on the list is solid wall insulation, and we found that provided you have all those other measures, it's possible to have a cost-effective heat pump without necessarily fitting that. For a house, it's typically £10,000 to do that installation, and in some cases it might be less economic to do that. So what does this all mean for flats? Well, on the face of it, our study recommends individual heat pumps for those, and that's definitely possible. The top photo on the slide there shows air source heat pumps installed in flats in Scotland. However, there are extra technical and economic challenges of fitting heat pumps in flats compared to, say, doing that in homes. And that led us to conclude that for a lot of flats, shared systems like heat networks could be a better solution. Now, I'll come back to those and explain what they are in more detail in a moment, but just to explain the technical challenges for heat pumps in flats. A key one is space outside for equipment. So air source heat pumps, we need an outdoor unit, and you can see the picture on the slide there. Those have been installed on balconies. But if that's not an option, then the units would need to go either in the garden or perhaps be mounted on a wall. Now, the second photo on the slide shows that can quickly add up to a lot of equipment. The second challenge is having space inside a flat for hot water tank and heat pump equipment that's necessary. Lots of flats don't have a hot water tank now. To save space, they've moved to combi boilers. So finding space for that tank plus other equipment might also be a big challenge. Now, we couldn't model those challenges because they're very specific to individual buildings, but we know these are likely to apply in a lot of situations for flats and tenements. So there are also economic challenges facing fitting heat pumps in flats versus fitting them in houses. The first of those is that there are fewer scale economies for installing smaller systems. You can see the average costs and the average size there on the slide of fitting heat pumps in our model to houses and flats. And although the systems in the flats are quite a bit smaller, they're only ever so slightly cheaper. And that's because a lot of the cost of installation is actually labour rather than equipment. And that doesn't reduce much if you're installing a smaller heat pump. So there are less cost savings to installing in flats. And on the flip side of that, it suggests that installing a shared system, so doing the work at the same time and sharing some resources between multiple flats, could be a cheaper way of fitting those heating systems. The other challenge we found was that it was harder to achieve lower energy bills in our modelling for the flats. So a majority of the houses did enjoy lower energy bills after making the recommended upgrades, but few of the flats did so. And that's because of a number of reasons, but many of them are to do with size. And again, that could be mitigated by combining multiple flats into a single system. So what do I mean by shared systems? And I'm referring there to heat networks and communal heating, which are basically large systems that connect multiple homes or even buildings to a single large heat source. And the heat is transferred between buildings by piping hot water from the original source. So there are two types. A heat network is a large system that serves multiple buildings, can even be whole areas of a town or city. So for example, Copenhagen in Denmark is entirely heated on a very large heat network. Or it can be communal heating, where a single boiler serves multiple homes or units in the same building. And that's quite common already in larger commercial buildings in Scotland. The great thing with these systems is that they're very versatile. So they can take heat from a variety of different sources. So on the slide there, you can see photos of a system in Clydebank, which takes heat from the Clyde using a heat pump. In Edinburgh, which takes heat from a local park using ground source heat pumps. And a photo from a system in Stirling, which is a heat network that takes heat from the local wastewater treatment plant. So it opens up lots of sources of renewable heat, and it allows us to tap into economies of scale, which are particularly useful for flats. So we made clear findings that shared systems are likely to have advantages for flats and tenements, and you can see those arguments summarised in the table on the slide. It's not just us saying this, lots of bodies have reached the same conclusion, and the UK and Scottish governments are also designing their policies to encourage the development of heat networks in areas where they make sense with very dense heat demand, so city and town centres. And there are examples already in Scotland. You can see a photo there of Kilbane Court in Greenock, which is a communal system with large air source heat pumps on the roof feeding the flats below. There's been less experience of doing this with older tenements, but the photo on the slide there is from a feasibility study by Southseeds, which explains how you could fit a high temperature heat network to a block of older tenements. So you might be wondering what to do with this information and where to go next. Well, the good news is that it's not being left to individual flat owners to organise and develop these systems. Local authorities are being supported by the government to seed the development of them. And a key milestone will be the publication this year of local heat strategies by local authorities that must identify the zones that are most suitable in their areas for those heat networks. And the slides there shows Glasgow City Council's very recently published plan, and the colour zones are those identified as suitable for heat networks. The next step for this will be that they will then use planning and other tools to either develop those heat networks themselves or to work with the private sector to get those underway. Now, this will take some time. We probably won't see much development for a fair few years yet. So our advice in the meantime to flat owners is to look up your local plan. And if you're in a zone, focus on those fabric improvements that you can make to get the home ready. If you are considering fitting an individual system, think carefully about that, because the more people that do that in blocks that are suitable for these shared systems, the less economic that system will be. And then you could perhaps speak to your local councillors and emphasise the importance of moving these plans forward. If you're outside of a zone, again, the first stop is to look at energy efficiency. It might be possible for individual buildings to get a communal system, even if they're not in the heat network zone, and Scottish Government is providing support to groups looking to explore that option. And as I said earlier, there are also likely to be individual options still open to flats. So I'll leave it there. Many thanks for listening. That's been a really rapid overview of a very big topic, but I look forward to answering any questions you might have in the Q&A.
Great, thanks, Fabrice, for that presentation. There's a lot in there actually to sort of get some questions from. Absolutely. I had a couple really to sort of get us started. Actually, can you talk through a little bit? I know you talked about the cost around heat pumps. Can you talk a little bit about potential costs around heat networks?
Sure. That's a really good question. I think the answer for kind of what the cost might be to a tenement flat owner is slightly more complicated than for the individual systems. I think largely because each network will be slightly different in terms of kind of its own economics. I think the heating costs are likely to be the same or lower than gas. More advantage of these kinds of systems is you're more able to use larger, more efficient heat pumps using perhaps slightly warmer sources. So the ground or river water will tend to be warmer throughout the year than the air. So they have an advantage over the air source heat pumps. In terms of the upfront cost, per home, I think it's probably, from what I've seen, similar if not higher than for the air source heat pumps. But the way this is paid for kind of works slightly better. Often the charges for the infrastructure are paid back over time through the kind of on top of the heating charge. So rather than paying off the household are paying off one large lump sum at the beginning of the installation, you pay it off over a number of years. So whoever's owning and operating that heat network, they will borrow the infrastructure investment and then they'll pay it back through the charges. I think from what I've seen, there is still often a charge to the individual household initially. That's often for changes to equipment inside the home. But those costs are broadly similar to what we're paying at the moment for fossil fuel boilers. So unfortunately, it's not a very clear answer. It'll really depend on each heat network. But I think one of the key messages that we found from our work is that there are lots of advantages to those larger systems when we're talking about flats. So we think the costs will be advantageous.
Yeah. The one thing that struck me sort of in your presentation there was the challenges around heat pumps in tenement flats. And you talked about the financial challenges and the technical challenges. And there was one thing from our end as someone that provides information and support around organizing common repairs and the rules around organizing common repairs in tenement buildings is the management side of things. So, and that I think that's also another big challenge, I think, with heat pumps when it comes to tenement flats. So you talked about how financially it doesn't make as much sense for the individual heat pumps going one heat pump for one flat. And also there's the space considerations that you have, particularly in urban settings with tenement flats. I think some of the other things that we've come across and thought a lot about is what would actually be required of tenement owners to approve this. So right now, to give our viewers a little bit of background, assuming the title deeds are silent on the issue of these kinds of heating systems, which most inevitably will be, then the rules around organizing repairs in common areas reverts to the Tenement Act. And we've got a lot of information about that on our website. But summarized, you would need, if it's a repair or maintenance, you need a majority of the owners to agree to go ahead with it. If it's an improvement, you need all the owners to go forward with it. Now, one of the Tenement Act, it details, detail is not quite the word, it generalizes what would be considered repair or maintenance versus what would be, and then you just sort of extrapolate from that whether or not it's improvement. So insulation, for example, due to I think it was a different piece of legislation that affected this act, said that insulation is considered a repair or maintenance. It's difficult because the words itself, improvement, I mean, yes, you're improving the energy efficiency of the building, so you could call it improvement. But for the terms of the act, it's actually repair or maintenance. So you need a majority of the owners to go ahead with like an exterior insulation for the walls, and that's good. You wouldn't need everyone to agree to go forward with that. The problem is that with heating systems, there's no mention of it at all. So, and therefore leads up to interpretation of whether or not you would need a majority of the owners to agree to it or all of them to agree to it. Now, if you're in a situation where you've got an individual heat pump going to the flat, obviously you wouldn't, if there was nothing that was being done outside in the common areas, then you wouldn't need to ask all the other owners. But with a heat pump, you're going to be putting it either in the back garden or you're going to be putting it on the roof. And those generally are common areas. In fact, the tenement, one of your deeds might actually say that the back garden's actually under control of the ground floor flat. But most of the time you would say that would be a common area. Therefore, you're going to need, they're not going to pay for it, but you're going to need some sort of agreement for the other owners to allow you to put an individual heat pump out there. You're going to need a majority of them to do so. And particularly, you're going to need support of that ground floor flat owner who's going to have a heat pump potentially right outside of their flat. Now, heat pumps are, particularly modern ones, are not particularly noisy, but at the same time, they do make a little bit of noise, and they're going to run during the winter quite often, actually. So it's not so much a matter of you shouldn't go forward with heat pumps. The difficulty is actually the reality of it's going to be difficult to get owners who have to make common decisions around common areas of tenements, tenement buildings, to actually agree to let you do that. And so that's a particular sense, and that's assuming that your interpretation of whether or not this is a repair or maintenance, or whether it's actually improvement. Because if it's improvement, you need everybody to agree. And if you live in a tenement flat, which probably most of the people here do, it's difficult to get everybody to agree on paying the cleaner to sweep the floors. Never mind actually, and some minor stuff. Never mind actually talking about putting a heat pump out in the back. So that's one of the challenges actually that we've talked a little bit about as a barrier for this. Now, one of the solutions you talked about would be a communal heat pump in that area, and that would be something that would benefit everybody potentially in the building. Now, I'm wondering if you've heard of any pilot projects or anything like this, because I know from our perspective, I know Home Energy Scotland is looking for owners to go ahead with a pilot project that would do a communal heat pump in the back garden, and that would be something that would benefit everyone. But you probably need everybody to sort of go along with it. But are you familiar with that as something that has worked either here or in other areas around the world, or is that something it's more of like sort of that's what should be done, but in reality there's not much evidence right now on whether or not that's been able to go forward as a pilot?
So there are examples of connecting types of heat network to existing homes. They're relatively few and far between in the UK. Most of the heat networks that we have concentrate initially on kind of city centres, commercial buildings. I think Annie will put in the chat a link to a video which is from a project in Cornwall, where they link terrace houses, I believe, to a shared heat network running on ground source heat pumps. So that gives us an example of what it might look like in the UK. And I think if we look abroad, it's very commonplace in parts of Europe, particularly Scandinavia, for whole towns and cities to be heated in this way. I think what it would look like in terms of overcoming some of those institutional barriers, and I live in a tenement myself, understand very well the challenges of working with a whole block of people to organise things. I guess one advantage of this is the way it's worked abroad is it's done on an area basis. So take Denmark, for example. Once the heat network is deciding to expand into an area, they will engage, whoever's operating that heat network will engage the local community, essentially to talk to them about what needs to happen in their homes, how the new system will work. So there's kind of a third party that takes on a lot of the responsibility for designing and putting in place what's needed. Still obviously needs to be agreement from communities, and everybody needs to connect to those systems within a certain time frame. So that does require people to change at a certain given point, but that's linked very much to the individual development of that heat network, if that makes sense.
Yeah. I mean, and I guess circling back to the original, probably the first part, because it was a very long question I was asking. Are you familiar with, like, in other words, or maybe, and maybe it was a slight different interpretation of it, an actual sort of a heat pump that would just serve one building, rather than a district heating where you would have that would heat both the flats in the neighborhood and the houses, and so you would have that. So because the district heating, from the perspective we've looked at, district heating actually is possibly the solution to heating flats, and we'll get into some questions that have been asked about that as far as covering areas. But I mean, have you heard of anything as far as sort of a heat pump that would just be for one building, in other words, or is that something that's, like I said, from what we've heard, there's potential funding for a pilot for it, but not actually heard of one building that has actually decided we're going to put a heat pump that'll connect up to everybody just in our building.
So there are a few examples in Scotland of tended to be tower blocks where they've connected to one large air source heat pump or a few multiple ones. So that definitely exists. I would agree that the big gap is the older tenement stock. I'm not aware at the moment of that being applied to those types of flats. And I think that would be great to see. At this stage, it will take an interested block to come forward and apply to the various grant schemes, of which there are quite a few that are available, to try and pilot that. I'd say it's a gap in Scottish government policy as well, very focused on the kind of building out heat networks in the areas that it's easiest. But given the high proportion of flats in Scotland and the likely important role that heat networks will play for a lot of those, we'd like to see the Scottish government emphasis as much about making sure that homes are a part of those plans.
Yeah. We've got a question actually from Chris. Actually, it says how, and Gillian, pop in here if you've got a view on this. I know you're about to give your presentation too, and this will touch on some of the topics that we're actually talking about right now. But the question that Chris asks is, how likely is that politicians will introduce regulations to force homeowners to connect to heat networks? Wouldn't a mandate be contrary to consumer protection regulations, especially around protecting consumer choice? Does anybody have any thoughts on that?
I can take that one. So that's certainly one of the plans that's in the pipeline, is to have that kind of obligation to connect, which was very crucial in Denmark in terms of their rollout of heat networks. It's all bound up within the Heat Networks Act of Scotland. I think as far as I understand it, there are certainly kind of competition issues that need to be resolved. So the form of that requirement is probably less than what the industry says it needs to be able to make these things move forward. And I know Gillian will touch on the wider regulatory framework. So the short answer is it is coming. The question is whether it will be effective enough. But certainly there's lots of experience from other countries across Europe we can draw on, because that's been a really key way that you coordinate people to connect to these developments.
And a follow-up to that from Chris as well is around the sort of how realistic the example you gave was of Glasgow and the district heating network in Glasgow, and how, as far as heat network zones and how realistic that should be. But actually, the second question is something that's come up regularly from us, which is, should people be waiting for heat networks in these areas, or pressing ahead with individual or communal heat pumps for their buildings if they have the opportunity to do so? Because that's one of and I'm not sure. I mean, I wouldn't expect that you would have an answer. I've not heard this answer to this either, because I'm not sure there is one around the question of, well, the scenario, which is somebody decides to go forward with putting in a heat pump, and then district heating comes along within the lifespan of that heat pump, and therefore you basically ended up spending more money than you needed to. Is there, I mean, more of an answer to the question, is there any just thoughts on how do you manage that? I mean, from our perspective, I know that we've talked about basically is, again, that's where we need some certainty, so people know when these district heating networks are coming in, so they can therefore plan. And also something that we'll touch upon in a second when Gillian talks about is, if there's going to be legislative mandates around when to phase out gas boilers, people that is lined up with those district heating systems coming, district heating networks coming in. So again, you've got those all lined up in such a way that people are not having to spend more than is necessary to change over to new heating systems, because we certainly don't want a situation where people are moving from one and then to another again.
Yeah, it's a great question. Unfortunately, it's really difficult to answer because, as has been alluded to, there's political uncertainty around the pace at which we'll get the right funding and the policies to drive all of this. And that's really unhelpful, because it leaves people waiting for some of these solutions, and that's at the whim of kind of both national and local politicians. What I would say is, I guess you can think about low regrets, things that you can do. So things that work in multiple future scenarios. And I think those would be energy efficiency, absolutely. So that's going to help you, whatever low carbon heating system that you end up with. So that's the absolute first thing to be thinking about. I guess the communal systems, if a block can self-organize and create its own low carbon heat system, that would be low regrets. Now, my understanding from abroad, again, where homes already have a low carbon heating system, essentially exempted from having to join the local heat network. I think where it gets problematic is individual flats within blocks, because if we have too many flats in an area that have their own heat pump, and other flats can't have them, if only half of the local area is connecting up to that communal system, the economics of that are going to be much harder, it'll be much more expensive. Whereas if you take a whole block out of the equation, then that's kind of sorted.
Yeah. And speaking of the low and no regrets, before we move on to Gillian's presentation, there are organizations that have started up, particularly in the last couple of years, community organizations and co-ops that I would recommend, particularly if you live in Glasgow. Take a look at Local Homes and the work that they're doing to try to work with local community. They're in that local community, particularly on the south side, but they will have lessons for all of everyone actually looking onto their website on what can be done about linking up the community with opportunities to do retrofit work in their buildings. In Edinburgh, you have Edinbrick, and I'll see if we can get Annie can pop up a link for them. Again, these are people that are looking to work on a real local community basis to work with flat owners in their neighborhoods on low and no regret retrofit work that can be done. And they're an excellent way to sort of also engage with your community and to look at how you can improve energy efficiency in your flat. So thanks for that, Fabrice. I know we've got a lot of questions, but I wanted to get on. Gillian's got some really, really useful information to convey. So I wanted to let Gillian sort of talk about her presentation. And then what we'll do is we'll come back, take some questions, take some more questions, and we'll take it from there. So Gillian, I'll hand it over to you now. Thanks for waiting.
Thanks, Mike. Thanks very much. And my slides should be appearing on the screen any moment. And let me just go back to the start of them. There we go. Great, thanks very much. Just to kick off, my name's Gillian Campbell from the Existing Homes Alliance. For those who don't know, the Existing Homes Alliance is a coalition of energy, fuel poverty, housing and industry organisations that are campaigning, working together to develop and shape policy solutions to help us improve the quality of Scotland's existing homes in a way that reduces our carbon emissions and ends fuel poverty. So what I'm going to be doing is looking at what needs to be in place if we're going to successfully decarbonise our owner-occupied homes. How do we go about creating successful customer journeys to zero emissions homes that work for and make sense to homeowners? First, I'm going to look at what we can expect to see in terms of regulation over the next few years, and perhaps cut through some of the noise that's in the media just now. Then I'm going to look at the support framework that we think is needed to help us get to zero emissions homes. What kind of advice and support do homeowners need to make zero emissions homes a reality? And then finally, I'm going to look at what we can be doing in the meantime in terms of preparing for what we know is coming down the line for all of us. But critically, I'm also very keen to hear what you need to help you understand what you need to do over the next few years and how to go about doing it. So please do put your thoughts in the chat or send them in afterwards so that we can use these to inform our responses to consultations and as we engage with the Scottish Government and so on. So thank you. So kicking off, first of all, looking at what might be coming down the line in terms of new regulations. Now, the Heat and Buildings Strategy was published by the Scottish Government 2 years ago now, and that set out an ambition. It set out Scotland's, what we need to do for to achieve Scotland's legally binding. Sorry, I forgot to say polls will pop up on your screen, and they also pop up on my screen. So feel free to answer these as we go through the presentation. So Heat and Building Strategy was published 2 years ago, setting out that to achieve Scotland's legally binding climate change targets, we need to decarbonise all of Scotland's buildings by 2045. And to reach that, the strategy says we need to see over 1 million homes switching to zero emissions heating by 2030. Now, to drive this scale of change, the Scottish Government has committed to introducing new regulations through a Heat and Buildings Bill, and we're expecting to see a consultation on proposals for that bill to be published over the next few weeks. We're hoping that when the First Minister sets out his programme for government next week, the Heat and Buildings Bill will feature in that. Now, the Alliance's members and supporters feel very strongly that early sight of these new regulations is critical in terms of setting out a much needed pathway for homeowners, landlords and the supply chain so that they understand what it is they need to do and by when to make their homes energy efficient, saving on energy bills now and in the future. So what might it say? It's clear that improved energy efficiency and electrification of heat will do the bulk of the work for decarbonising Scotland's homes. And to reflect this, it's likely that the proposals will focus on two things. First of all, the phasing out of gas boilers, and secondly, the introduction of minimum energy efficiency standards. First of all, in phasing out of boilers, it's likely that this will be targeted at houses initially, as there are clear zero emissions solutions out there that work well for the vast majority of homes, as we've just heard about from Fabrice. It may be that regulations will require zero emissions heating to be installed at the point of sale or when the boiler needs to be replaced. At the moment, we don't know, and this will all be determined through consultation. It's unlikely, though, that this will be applied to flats at this stage, as the solutions are more complex, as Fabrice said. For many flats, the zero emissions heating solution is going to be connection to a heat network. So we're dependent on the zoning of heat network areas and the development of local heat networks before most flat owners can decarbonise their heating. The second element, which in some ways should be the first element in my view, is energy efficiency. The Heat and Buildings Strategy suggests that the majority of buildings should have a good level of energy efficiency by 2030. That's the equivalent of EPCC. It was proposed that this would be introduced by 2025, with all owner-occupied homes meeting this by 2033. In terms of the private rented sector, there was a previous commitment to introduce regulations requiring properties to reach EPC-D by 2025. However, in recognition of COVID challenges, this was delayed, and it's likely to be that homes in the private rented sector will be required to meet EPC-C by 2028. Looking specifically at flats, We believe at the Alliance that there needs to be a phased approach for tenements. We think that the focus should be on coordinating whole building retrofits, whole building improvements. But given the complexity of this, we think there needs to be an interim energy efficiency standard that can be applied to individual flats earlier on, say from 2030. Now, you will note that the regulations will be built around the Energy Performance Certificate, or EPC, and I know there was a couple of points about this in the chat earlier, and you may also have seen some coverage of this in the media over the last few weeks. EPCs are a vital tool in helping us to improve our homes. They're long established and one of the few pieces of information homeowners and landlords have to help them understand the performance of their home. It's widely accepted right across the UK that EPCs need to be reformed. Currently, they work against electric heating systems, grading gas systems higher. So the UK Climate Change Committee, which is the independent statutory advisor to the UK and devolved governments, has recommended changes to ensure that the EPC system is fit for purpose and they help us to get to net zero. So based on advice from the UK Climate Change Committee and on consultation and expert working groups that were held over the last couple of years, the Scottish Government has published proposals for reform of EPCs. I'm not going to go into the detail of that just now, but the intention is that they'll provide clearer information on energy efficiency, the type of heating system, and the cost of heating the home. It will identify whether the heating system meets the proposed zero direct emissions heating standard. And critically, the new style EPCs it's proposed will include links to advice and support and links to more tailored recommendations on how to improve energy efficiency and reduce emissions. The EPC proposals are out for consultation just now, and you can comment on these up until the 16th of October. And I think Annie has shared links to some of these documents in the chat. As well as the EPC consultation, as I said earlier, we're expecting the Scottish Government to publish proposals for phasing out fossil fuel boilers and minimum energy efficiency standards in the next few weeks. So by this time next year, we should all have a much better idea of what we need to do and by when. But regulations are only one part of the jigsaw puzzle, and they won't be successful without an accompanying effective enabling framework. Here's another poll for you to have a look at. So alongside the regulations, we need to be helping people to invest in their homes. If we're going to meet the statutory climate change targets that were agreed by the Scottish Parliament, we need people to be moving ahead of regulations, and we need people to want to improve their homes as well as being required to do so by regulation. And without targeted support for those most in need, we risk leaving behind those who are unable to access the advice and support they need or who can't afford the upfront costs. We commissioned the Energy Saving Trust to carry out research to define the kinds of customer journeys needed to get us to zero emissions heating. The objectives of that research was to identify the key attributes for an advice and support environment that makes sense from the householder's perspective and meets their needs. The research found that the current current framework of advice and support provides a strong foundation on which to build, but there are a number of gaps and barriers in the current approach. First of all, people aren't clear about what they need to do to upgrade their home or when they need to do it by. There's a lack of awareness of the support available and uncertainty about where to go for support and who to trust. Existing services are stretched and operating pretty much at capacity with little scope to deal with increased demand. But there are also gaps in the kinds of services available, particularly in relation to independent advice and support through the installation process. And there's also a lack of easy access to post-installation support and redress if things go wrong. Financial support is viewed as complex, inflexible and unattractive, particularly to lower income households, and the process for accessing funding is deemed to be lengthy and complex. Eligibility criteria often excludes owner-occupiers who are at risk of fuel poverty but are deemed to be able to pay, so they're just outside the definition of fuel poverty. High upfront costs can be a major barrier for some households, and the low value of some homes compared to the cost of the retrofit can make some work financially unviable. And there are, of course, significant challenges in relation to multi-ownership homes, with real difficulties in engaging in mixed tenure blocks with multiple homeowners, often including private landlords and owners of commercial premises. There's often uncertainty about who's responsible for communal or shared areas, and the complexity of some of these projects can mean potentially high levels of disruption. So based on that research, including lessons learned from a review of European approaches, we've identified a number of elements that we think need to be in place if we're to create successful customer journeys to zero emissions homes. I'm not going to go through all of them, there's 10 of them or something, but you can read about them in our customer journey briefing paper, which hopefully will be shared. I'm going to focus on the 3 most critical elements just now though. First of all, effective awareness raising. Customers need clarity about standards, what needs to be done and by when. And this is key to giving not just consumers, residents, confidence, but also supply chains the confidence to invest in their businesses and scale up to meet growing demand. Now, this should come in part through regulations, but it's essential that there are also complementary local and national awareness raising campaigns so that people are clear about the benefits of energy efficiency and zero emissions heating and know where to go for information, advice and support. The second step in the customer journey is finding out more and taking action. We think that one-stop shops should be at the heart of that journey, as this would address a number of the barriers that we'd identified through the research. Now, one-stop shops can be virtual or physical places where homeowners can find all the information and services they need. The concept of the one-stop shop is seen as a core element of retrofit strategies across Europe, including Ireland, where they're being provided by registered private operators who manage the entire process from the initial assessment of the home through grant applications, project management, and engaging contractors. Well, the Scottish Government's National Advice Service, Home Energy Scotland, is often referred to as a one-stop shop. In its current form, it only offers some of the services that we think are required, with significant gaps, such as the coordination or project management role. A number of private sector and not-for-profit organisations, some of which have already been mentioned this morning, are starting to provide these services here in Scotland. And we feel strongly that these kinds of services need to be supported to grow and develop right across the country. But Home Energy Scotland, along with a wide range of local advice and support services that already exist, do provide a really strong starting point. And the final issue I'm going to talk about here is that we need a range of financial support mechanisms to address the barriers of high upfront costs of upgrading energy efficiency and heating. The Scottish Government set up a Green Heat Finance Task Force to look into this, and we're expecting recommendations from them at some point over the next few months. The Existing Homes Alliance has also commissioned some research into financing options that could be applied here in Scotland, and we'll be publishing that report in the next week or two, but I can preview a couple of the recommendations with you just now. First of all, some of the financial measures that would have the biggest impact are reserved to the UK government, such as making changes to energy pricing so that electricity becomes more attractive than gas, and that's a major hurdle that really needs to be addressed soon. But some of the actions, there are some actions that the Scottish Government can be taking, such as, for example, considering tax incentives targeted at people who are moving house, or piloting property-linked finance approaches. This is where the finance borrowing is linked to the property rather than the owner, with repayment obligations passing to subsequent owners when the property is sold. Now, this kind of approach can be particularly useful in flats where, for example, communal energy improvements could be funded through an ongoing service charge. This is a model that's already used in some parts of the United States, where the financing of certain improvements is paid through property taxes. And closer to home, the Greater Manchester Combined Authority and the Welsh Government are both exploring this kind of approach. So to finish off, we know that regulations are coming, and I think another poll might pop up at some point, so be ready for that. All around the world, there are, here it is, there are developing, all around the world, governments are developing and implementing plans to switch from fossil fuel heating to zero emissions heating. In the UK, we really need to catch up. Other parts of Europe and the USA are pushing ahead with incentivising zero emissions heating like heat pumps and heat networks. The new heat and buildings regulations will play a vital role in ensuring we catch up and meet our legally binding climate change and fuel poverty targets. And critically important for people in flatted areas will be the development of the local heat and energy efficiency strategies that we heard about earlier, and creating clear pathways for the creation of heat networks. But, oh, we're moving slides, yikes. Hang on. There we go. We don't need to wait for regulations and for heat networks. There are things we can be doing in the meantime that will help us reduce our energy bills, keep warmer this winter, and cut our greenhouse gas emissions. The first thing we need to do is start planning. What can you do now that could make your home more energy efficient? There's advice out there to help you identify what you can do with your home, from Home Energy Scotland to organisations such as South Seeds, Local Home, Iala Impacts, NestFit in the North East, and Changeworks. All of these organisations provide practical advice and support to help you improve the energy efficiency of your home. And Scotland has some of the most generous grant and loan programmes around at the moment, which can cover much of the cost. Home Energy Scotland grants are available for homeowners, covering up to 75% of the cost of energy efficiency improvements. That's up to £7,500 or £9,000 if you live in rural areas. And you can get the same again to contribute to the cost of a heat pump if that is a suitable option for you. What I would say, someone asked this question earlier, I think, about electric heating. That grant funding does support the installation of efficient electric systems, I believe. So have a look at the Home Energy Scotland website to find out more. Remaining costs on top of the grant can be covered by interest-free loans, by the way. And for private landlords, there's a Scottish Government loan fund that can also be accessed through Home Energy Scotland. And for those who are interested in pushing forward with zero emissions heating, and we touched on this earlier, there is help available through Local Energy Scotland. The Community Heat Development Programme is designed to support community organisations and groups of householders to develop their ideas for locally generated low and zero carbon heat projects. Participants in the project will get technical support to look at the feasibility of projects. And while the programme won't necessarily pay for the installation of the renewable technology or energy efficiency measures, it will advise on feasibility and advise on next steps and routes to further funding. So that's a quick overview of what we're expecting in terms of regulations, what we know. We're in a bit of a state of flux at the moment. We're waiting for this consultation to be published, and over the next few months, as I said earlier, all will become much clearer. But this is, our perspective on what we expect to see in terms of regulations and what kind of additional support we think is needed to help us get to zero emissions buildings. As I say, the next few weeks and months are absolutely critical in terms of making sure we meet our climate change and fuel poverty targets. And what I would say is important to recognise is what's being proposed here is no different to approaches that are being taken in other countries around the world. The sooner homeowners, landlords and supply chains know what they need to do and by when, the sooner they can start planning and investing in making their homes warmer, cheaper to heat and lower greenhouse gas emissions. In the meantime, I do urge you to consider what things you can do now to take advantage of the support that's available and start reducing your energy consumption and making your home warmer. There is a feedback form, and we're really keen to hear what you think is needed to help you make more energy efficient, your homes more energy efficient, and switch to zero emissions heating. So please do complete that form, and we can use that information to inform our own consultation responses, but also in our discussions with the Scottish Government. So if we've got time, I'm happy to discuss further and take any questions. Thank you.
Thank you, Gillian, for that. It's interesting. So, having listened to your presentation and Fabrice as well, and taking a look at the questions that are coming through, it's clear that there are far more questions than there are answers at this point. But this is the point at which a lot of the input is so important, because the Scottish government is moving towards setting down some markers and some legislation around this stuff. We're going to see a heat and buildings bill soon that's going to be consulted on. Well, consultation's going to be coming out fairly soon. We're seeing the consultation around EPC, which a number of people have been talking and asking questions about, the changes to that and how it will incorporate energy efficiency. So doing energy efficiency doesn't actually make your EPC worse, which is a potential problem right now, and one the Scottish government has rightfully identified. So that consultation is already out, and I should say, for those of us that are not part of organizations, so consultations can be answered by anyone. They do not need to be from sort of organizations. Some of the questions are a little bit more probably technical, but you don't have to answer every single question. You can just answer, with consultations, you can just answer the questions that affect you or that you're knowledgeable about. So having been doing policy work myself off and on for years as an organization, but I also know that individuals can do this too, and you don't need to answer all the questions. So getting that input in is really important from your own particular experience. And as the questions have been identifying, there are lots of individual circumstances or building-wide circumstances that are going to make that input important. So please do get in touch. Follow the links that Annie's put up as far as sort of feeding back to Gillian, because the Existing Homes Alliance, which we're part of as well, we'll be speaking directly, putting in their consultation, but speaking directly to ministers and conveying your concerns. And they want Existing Home Alliance exists to take in those concerns and the questions that are raised today. So I really encourage you to fill out that form and talk about your own personal experiences and what you think the challenges are going to be. So we can, Existing Homes Alliance and other organizations can directly speak to the people that will be crafting this legislation, so they're aware of it before they're setting down what they're going to do. Let's go through a bunch. We're over time already, but we've still got a bunch of people on. We'll see if we can get through a bunch of these questions and taking a look at them. There's a few in here that I think it's probably unlikely we have the expertise to answer. I would recommend, once again, to putting in those questions to us in the way that I talked about before, through our website or I believe it's in the handout section, but Annie can correct me in the chat room about where you can put your questions that we can make sure they get answered. If not from Gillian and Fabrice, then other experts. Between the three of us, we know quite a few people in the sector and should be able to get forward that question on to somebody who does know the answer if we don't. This might be one for you, Fabrice. I don't know if you know the answer to it, but so I'll throw it out there and hopefully you won't get caught out. But is there any international experience in assigning usage costs in communal systems that you're aware of?
That's a good question. Yes, there'll be lots of experience. I think if you look up Heat in the City, it's part of Edinburgh University. That's a group of academics that have looked at examples from abroad, how they've structured their heat networks, how you pay for all of it. So there's lots of published evidence about how this is done, and it's really not. Heat networks existed in this country for 50 years. They're just not very widespread. So it's really an established technology, and there are lots of different ways to do it. In terms of just one point on the funding, I guess one key thing that we need to see maintained is Scottish Government funds for initial development of these heat networks, particularly where they're using low carbon heat, because the more we can put public funding in there, the lower we can make people's energy bills. So there's an interesting development in Midlothian where I think it's Midlothian Council have joined forces with Vattenfall, which is a Swedish energy company. They're jointly developing a heat network there. And that's an interesting model where the public sector retains direction within the project and is involved, but they've also got that expertise of an international company that does this abroad.
Yeah, that's interesting. Because I think I saw some of those speakers at an event a couple of weeks ago, and would really meant that Heat in the City would really recommend taking a look at the work that they do. There's some really knowledgeable people that are talking about district heating. And actually, one of the presentations was on the history of trying to implement this in Edinburgh. One of the key over the last 50 years, and the failures to do so. And one of the main points that was made by the professor that took part was the sort of the linking up of the infrastructure and the funding for that, and also sort of being able to sort of make a clear idea of when that actually, what's going to actually go forward and when, and therefore then setting down actually allowing people to make decisions on how best to do that, because there needs to be some guarantees from organizations that would be setting up the district heating systems, that how that's going to actually go forward and how it will be actually funded, and when it will be spread out. So do we have one question here I wanted to direct over to you, Gillian, that you might have an answer to, or have some thoughts on. Where was it here? Oh, this was one from Jane. She says here that rental properties are required to have a fixed heating system by March 1st, 2024. Consultations do not leave much time for landlords to decide which system is best within their limited time scale. Do you believe that this date will be extended? Do you have any thoughts on what, I mean, this is predicting time, I think, potentially, but just want to confirm whether she's got, those dates are in fact correct, and also whether or not you think that that will be extended, because if that's right, that time frame is fairly tight.
It is fairly tight. I'm not entirely sure. I can't see the question here in front of me just now. I wouldn't like to speculate on whether the government is going to move dates on anything at the moment, if I'm honest. I think what we are clear about is that we have the targets to meet by 2030, and over the next few years there are going to be some clear dates that we need to meet in terms of decarbonising our heating. In terms of making decisions now, it is frustrating. I also live in a flat, as I think quite a few of us, certainly the speakers do, and it is frustrating trying to decide what to do as your boiler's coming to the end of its life and make a decision. And I think that's where we need absolute clarity in terms of the leadership and the messaging that's coming from the Scottish Government, that the heat pump solutions are, yes, the solutions for the vast majority, but we're not expecting all flat owners to suddenly start installing heat pumps to their properties. So I think what comes out from the Scottish Government over the next few weeks should hopefully give us some clarity on what our pathways are going to look like over the next few years. I'm not sure that particularly answers your question, Jane. I'm sorry about that.
Well, you did say earlier too that that's what you meant by the fact that the next few weeks and months are going to be important. That's because of the stuff that the consultations and potential legislative solutions that'll be coming out. Is that right?
Yeah, that's right. It feels a bit like make or break time at the moment. We've got, when the heat and building strategy first came out, it was 2 years ago now, as I said in my presentation. That gave us nearly a decade to decarbonise nearly half of our homes. That time has passed. We've now got sort of 7 years, less than 7 years to be doing this, and it's starting to feel more and more challenging. So the sooner the Scottish Government publishes some clear guidelines on what we're going to be expected to do, and the Scottish Parliament approves these, the sooner people can start to plan, can start to make decisions about their own energy efficiency investment and heating system investment, but also the sooner supply chains and businesses can start to think, well, there's going to be increased demand for this kind of technology, I shall invest in scaling up, growing my business to meet that increase in demand. So the number one priority needs to be a sort of clear pathway for homeowners so we can start to make decisions.
Yeah. Fabrice, we had a question right from the start, actually, from John, talk about your research saying that the pre-1919 tenement home type was 82 meters squared. The properties I have, which are most challenging, are around the 30 meters squared, so very little space for hot water cylinders or internal wall insulation. Did you look at very small home types?
No, we didn't look at homes that are that small, but that's because each of the typical homes represents a group of the most common types of home in Scotland. So I think space-wise, they match up to 95% of the housing stock. So those very small properties are rarer. I think my answer to the question there would be that's exactly the kind of situation where those advantages of the shared systems really come in, where you've got so little space inside and probably outside as well for equipment. Properties in that kind of situation, again, it would be those shared systems that can really get you get around some of those challenges.
Yeah. I mean, and do you think, and this throw this out to both of you, is just, as far as that there should be some flexibility? I mean, we all agree here that there is a climate emergency. We all agree that we need to reduce our carbon emissions. That said, we've been presented by questions and we've talked about some of the real challenges. And is it going to be the case that some, and hopefully a very small number, but some buildings are just going to be just too difficult, that you're not going to be able to, if you're put into a situation where you're going to actually have to put someone into fuel poverty in order to reduce the carbon emission systems, does it make sense, do you think, to have some flexibility? So, for example, even though district heating wouldn't be available for them for the next 10 years or so, that there's some allowance to be able to continue with the current heating system, because the alternative is putting in a heating system, which could be storage heat or something that actually could make electricity prices higher for that person and push them into fuel poverty. Is that something that it seems like a reasonable sort of way to go forward, or do you think that there's even problems with that, with giving too many exemptions?
Can I come in on that, please?
Sure, go for it.
What I would say is that any regulations that do come in will have exclusions, will have exemptions, and will be based on what is feasible and practical. I think there is a danger with giving too much flexibility. So what I would say in terms of supporting people who are in fuel poverty and preventing fuel poverty is we would urge flexibility in terms of how grant support can be used. So first of all, we think the grant funding and support for people at risk of fuel poverty should be scaled up, increased and broadened, but also made more flexible so that actually it could fund additional measures. If a heat pump, say, was installed in a house, or a system that could potentially result in higher heating costs was installed, there should be other measures funded to ensure that there's no negative impact on the cost of heating the home. So we need to have sufficient flexibility in terms of the grant funding that's available to make sure nobody is in a worse position financially than they were.
Yeah.
Or pushed into fuel poverty. The other point in terms of exemptions and exclusions, there will be some, but there's a risk that you have, if you have too many, there's a risk that you focus on the wrong thing. So it's not, we need to think more broadly about cost and value and price. And if we just think purely about what's it going to do to the value of the house, we need to start thinking about the cost of not carrying out some of these measures, not improving some of the homes, and the health costs that are related to people living in fuel poverty and living in cold, damp homes and things. We've got a very narrow definition of cost at the moment, so that's my one concern about being too flexible in terms of exemptions.
There's something else that's brought up too, and this is brought up regularly, and from my own experience, and I know from I'm sure that you've had a shared experience too, is when speaking with people within government, is to making sure that we're focused very much on what is called the fabric first approach, right? That you make sure that the building is warm and watertight. There's no point in insulating a building or putting in a new heating system to a wet, cold building. In addition, if you've got, with the amount of disrepair that we have, particularly to the older tenement buildings in Scotland, you're actually, the carbon impact of these buildings falling down and having to put up new ones is much greater than actually the work that needs to be done to keep those buildings standing, to keep them watertight, making sure that the fabric of the building is addressed as well. So I think one of the other things too, and you'll see this across the board, is that there needs to be a approach by Scottish government, and it's been communicated to them as well, so that they're aware of it, but the importance of keeping these buildings standing and keeping them in good repair, because if you're you're really addressing potentially the wrong problem in the wrong order. If you don't keep the building standing, then there's no point in addressing the carbon emission of a building that in 5 years will fall down. So you really want to focus on that. And, you know, when we're talking about funding for this work, it's clearly from a spending perspective of actually doing the work, it's much, much cheaper to do this all work at once. So if you're going to be doing some sort of work around insulation of a building, it's the scaffolding, for example, is a huge cost. So you might as well do the roof at the same time. And that's going to be a huge capital cost, though, for the owners of that building. So that's where you're going to need some sort of support, probably, to be able to make sure that you can get that thing done. But incentives to be able to when you're doing energy efficiency work is also at the same time addressing the fabric problems that you might have with the building. You do those two things together, and you're going to be saving money as well. So that's another thing that it's really important, added on to what you were just saying, Gillian, as well.
Can I just jump in on that, Mike, actually, which is one of the recommendations on our customer journey paper that I didn't touch on, was that the introduction of building renovation passports and a much more planned approach to how we maintain and upgrade our homes. I think that they potentially play a really significant role. It's something that's gaining momentum across Europe, but developing long-term maintenance and improvement plans that are endorsed by and signed up to by shared owners, I think is going to be a critical part of making this work. So, and that builds on something you're all very familiar with, of course, which is the recommendations of the tenement maintenance working group. So taking forward these recommendations at pace would be very beneficial in terms of improving the energy efficiency of our homes as well.
Yeah, no, I absolutely agree. That's one of the things that we worked on and has been put forward to Scottish Government back in 2019. Scottish Government has agreed to. Unfortunately, the legislation around these proposals won't be laid down until the next Parliament. But these are mandatory owners associations, building funds, and then the question of 5-year tenement inspections. And I know that there's a group of people that I'm working with right now that are in the final process of developing a proposal around 5-year tenement inspections and the building passport system. The idea that you would have something very simple, almost like it could be potentially like a traffic light system, the different elements of the building that would go into much more detail in the home report and give you an idea of what bits of the building are in good shape, potentially need some work in the next few years, or in critical condition and need actually addressing. And so all those things sort of really play together. I mean, a lot of this work that we're talking about can't be done if you don't have an owners association. That's one of the reasons we exist, is to help people form those owners associations. But if you don't have people talking in the building, it's impossible to do communal work. Because you have to all be talking to each other. And so doing something like mandatory owners associations, which is a worldwide standard. Scotland and England are the outliers, one of the few countries where it's not mandatory to have owners associations. So anyway, that will be coming in a few years down the road as well, hopefully. But another element to throw onto this. We're getting on to 12:30. I know we have a lot of questions that we haven't had a chance to address. I think probably the best thing to do is to collect up all those questions and then get back to people individually. So Annie, if you could again just post people in the direction in the main chat room of where people's questions have come in, and ask them to send those through. We will take those questions on and then make sure that we get a direct answer back to you, to everyone that has taken part. And finally, we'll be doing this presentation will be sent out to everyone, I think, on the just about today, I believe. So you can watch this back or pass it on to other people to take a look at. It'll be on the Under One Roof YouTube channel as well. And I would encourage you also to, in addition to the many links that you've been sent today, is to sign up on our website to our newsletter. This is where we not only talk about events like this, which are coming up, all of which are free, but also have articles on these very topics. And we have, for example, in the next newsletter, we'll be in the newsletters coming up talking with one of the people that are doing community retrofit works. We've talked about sort of a lot of the issues around organizing common repairs and some of the specific issues related to that, as well as interesting stuff that we found we think will be useful for you as a tenement flat owner or someone that's connected into that work. So yeah, please do. We've got Facebook and Twitter accounts and Instagram accounts as well for Under One Roof. I'd encourage you to do that to find out. We'll have regular updates on all these things, issues that we've talked about. With the success and the number of people that have attended today, we're certainly going to be continuing to do more of these events. So finally, thank you for attending. Thank you to Gillian and Fabrice for their presentations. They're incredibly useful, I think, for everybody, and I found them to be really helpful in explaining issues. So thanks again for your participation, and hopefully we will see you again when we have one of these very soon. So from Under One Roof and our team, thank you very much for attending today, and we'll talk to you soon. Bye now.